Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something. This isn't a tale of vengeance. It's not a recipe for getting even. It's a story about the weight of a soul. It's about a man who held a piece of justice in his hand, hot and heavy, and the terrifying realization that the act of delivering it can brand you just as deeply as the one who earned it. We all carry a little bit of darkness inside us. It's the shadow we cast when we stand in the light. Most of us spend our lives trying to keep that shadow small, tucked away behind a smile, a handshake, a promise. But there are moments that crack the world open, when that shadow threatens to swallow you whole. This is the story of a man who stared into his own shadow and fought like the devil to find the light again. So, pull up a chair. Let me tell you about David, and the painting, and the cost of a truth that nearly destroyed everything he held dear. David was a man who built his life on a foundation of faith, hard work, and family. He wasn't a man of great wealth, not in the way the world measures it. He was a craftsman, a woodworker. His shop on Maple Street was a cathedral of sawdust and the scent of freshly cut pine. He'd inherited it from his own father, a quiet, stoic man who believed that a man's word was his bond, and his hands were his legacy. David's hands were his legacy. They were rough and calloused, but they could coax a whisper of beauty from a lifeless block of wood. He could make a chair that would cradle a tired body for 100 years. He could make a toy that would spark a child's imagination for a lifetime. To him, those hands were sacred tools. They were meant for building, for creating, for nurturing. The very thought of them being used for anything else, for harm, was an obscenity. His world revolved around two people, his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Chloe. Sarah was the sun in his solar system, steady and warm. She was a music teacher, her fingers as graceful as his were strong. Their home was a symphony of sounds, the gentle rhythm of his woodworking tools, the melodic scales Sarah would play on the piano, and the laughter of their little girl. Chloe was 9 years old, a bright, inquisitive soul with hair the color of spun copper and eyes the size of sky-blue marbles. She was an artist. From the time she could hold a crayon, she was lost in a world of color and imagination. Her paintings were bold and joyful, portraits of a universe that was safe, and warm, and full of love. A purple elephant flying over a rainbow. A house made of gingerbread with a family of stick figures holding hands in the yard. A big golden sun with a smiling face, its rays warming the entire world. Her art was but a shadow, as you know, is always cast. It lurks in the periphery. For David, that shadow wore a familiar face. It was his younger brother, Ray. Ray was everything David was not. Where David was steady, Ray was restless. Where David was careful, Ray was reckless. Ray was the golden boy, the charmer, the one with the quick smile and the quicker handshake. He was a salesman, a man who could talk you into buying the snow off a winter's roof. He was handsome, with a swagger that seemed to make people gravitate towards him. He had an ease in the world that David, with his quiet diligence, never possessed. Their mother used to say, David is the oak, and Ray is the vine. The oak provides the strength, the shelter. The vine. Well, the vine just wraps itself around the oak, looking for its own nourishment. Deep down, David knew that. There was a part of him that always felt a little bit responsible for Ray. He'd bailed him out of scrapes with money and lies. He'd given him a job in his shop twice. Both times, Ray had quit, leaving behind a mess of half-finished projects and excuses. This isn't my path, Davy, he'd say. I'm a dreamer, you know? And yet, he was still David's brother. Family was the word. The bond of blood was sacred to David. It was an unbreakable thread, woven into the very fabric of his being. And Ray, for all his flaws, could be charming. He was the fun uncle. He showed up with shiny trinkets, with racy jokes, with an air of mystery that intrigued a child. He never had children of his own. His life was too fast, too free. Kids are a heavy anchor, Davy, he'd say. I need to sail the open seas. So, when Ray started paying more attention to Chloe, David initially saw it as a good thing. Uncle Ray is coming, Chloe would announce, her voice lacking its usual excitement. It was less of a cheerful greeting and more of a solemn pronouncement. A fact to be accepted. He thought she was just intimidated by his boisterous nature. He was wrong. It started subtly. The shifts were so small at first that David didn't even see them. He was a man in the trenches of his own life, fighting the battles of mortgages, taxes, and a demanding new client. He was a lion, focused on providing for his pride. He was the oak, focusing on providing shade. He failed to notice the ivy beginning to strangle the branches. The little signs were there, of course. They are always there, if you know what to look for. Chloe's laughter, once a bright, bubbling brook, became a trickle, a polite murmur. She would flinch if you came up behind her too fast. The light in her eyes, which had always been so open and warm, had gone behind a cloudy veil. It was a stranger's light. Distant. Guarded. But the biggest, the most bewildering change, was her art. The bold, sprawling landscapes on butcher paper and the bright, joyful characters had vanished. Now, her passion was for secrecy. She was no longer an artist, she was a curator of a secret museum, one that was only displayed in the dark. Chloe had taken to painting by candlelight. At first, it seemed like a game. A harmless new ritual. She would wait until the last sliver of daylight had vanished, close the heavy velvet curtains in her room, and then, with a solemn ceremony, light a single, tall white candle. David would hear her from the hallway, the scratch of her brush on canvas, the soft sound of her humming a haunting little song that sounded nothing like the cheerful melodies Sarah would play. And she would only do it in her closet. It was a deep, walk-in closet, and she had made a little den of it. She'd piled up her pillows and stuffed animals and created a cave where the only light was the flickering, golden flame of the candle. The walls of the closet, once a clean, neutral beige, were now covered in her paintings. But they weren't paintings to be shown. They were secret, private artifacts. When David would knock on the door and ask to see her latest creation, a wave of panic would wash over her face. Her little freckled cheeks would flush. "No, Daddy." She'd cry out, her voice thin and sharp as a blade of glass. "Not yet. It's a surprise." It was a surprise all right. The kind that punches you in the gut and steals the air from your lungs. One afternoon at the school art show, David and Sarah stood in the brightly lit gymnasium, beaming as they looked at the display of their daughter's beautiful landscapes and portraits. But as they were leaving, an old, frail hand reached out and gently gripped David's elbow. He turned to see Mrs. Alvarez, their next-door neighbor. She was a kind soul, a wise old woman in her 80s who still came out to water her garden every morning and would always wave to the family as they headed off to school and work. She was a great comfort to the neighborhood. She had a face that was a roadmap of life, her eyes, pale and watery, held a strange, haunted glint as she looked at him. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, her voice a dry whisper, like leaves rustling in the wind. "A word, please." David smiled down at her. "Of course, Mrs. Alvarez. How are you today?" "You need to listen to me," she said, her grip tightening on his arm. Her voice was low, urgent, a fragile whisper that seemed to be carried on the wind. "You need to listen to an old woman who has seen things she wishes she hadn't." She glanced around as if checking for spies. "Your daughter. The little one with the red hair and the eyes like the summer sky. She's been painting by candlelight in her closet at night." David's smile faltered. "Yes, I know," he said, trying to sound light-hearted. "It's a new hobby, I suppose. A phase." Mrs. Alvarez shook her head, a grim, sorrowful motion. Her eyes were fixed on his, searching. "No, Mr. Marchetti. No. It's more than a phase. That candlelight. It's a shield. It's a secret. What she paints in the dark. It's not meant for the light. It's not meant for the eyes of the world. You don't look at what's painted by candlelight. You're not supposed to." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, almost terrifying hush. "But, if you do, if you dare, you will know the truth." She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze boring into his soul. Then, she simply let go of his arm, turned, and shuffled away, her ancient, worn-out slippers scuffing on the polished gymnasium floor. David stood there for a long moment, a cold, icy dread pooling in his stomach. He looked at Sarah and forced a tight smile, dismissing it as the ramblings of a confused, elderly woman. He tried to put it out of his mind. He went home that evening and had a normal dinner with his family. He worked in his shop until the sun went down, the scent of wood and varnish a familiar comfort. He tried to convince himself that Mrs. Alvarez was just a lonely old lady, making a mountain out of a molehill. He told himself it was nothing. It was a silly, harmless game. But at 2:33 in the morning, he was jolted from a dead sleep. He lay there in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs, his sheets soaked with a cold sweat. He'd been having a nightmare, a formless, black terror with no face and the faint, acrid smell of candle smoke. He took a deep, shuddering breath and tried to will the fear away. He glanced over at Sarah. She was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even. His eyes then drifted to the crack of light under the door of his daughter's room. It was on. A flickering, dancing, amber light. She was awake, painting by candlelight in her closet. The need to know, the terrible, gnawing curiosity, clawed at him. It was a hunger that couldn't be denied. He had to see. He moved like a ghost, his bare feet silent on the warm, wooden floor. He reached Chloe's door and pushed it open with a soft, hesitant creak. The room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of the single candle. Chloe was a small figure in the corner of the closet, her back to him, her shoulders hunched over a small canvas. Her hair, a cascade of copper, shimmered in the light. She was humming that same low, melancholy tune. The song of a caged bird. He was about to speak, to call out her name, when she stopped. She lifted her head, sniffled, and carefully, reverently, took the painting she was working on and placed it face down on the floor, on top of a pile of others. She then turned, a happy, innocent smile on her face. "Oh, hi, Daddy," she said, her voice sleepy and sweet. He swallowed the lump in his throat and forced a smile. "It's very late, sweet pea. Time for bed." She nodded, blew out the candle with a soft PFFT, and scrambled into her bed, snuggling under the covers like a little mouse. David tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and waited until her breathing became slow and steady. When he was sure she was asleep, he crept back to her room. His entire body was trembling. The old woman's words were a relentless drumbeat in his head. "Don't look. You will know the truth." He knelt on the floor of the closet. He was surrounded by the paintings, all of them face down. He felt like a grave robber, like a thief. His hand trembled as he reached for the one she had just been working on. He took a deep breath, held it, and turned the small canvas over. He held it close to the window, where a sliver of moonlight seeped through the curtains, its weak light illuminating the crude, horrifying image. It was a crude, childlike drawing of a large figure. The figure had sharp, predatory features, a craggy nose, a slicked-back hairline, and cold, dead eyes. One hand was a cruel, claw-like appendage, reaching out toward a small, stick-figure girl whose mouth was a gaping black hole of silence. The large figure wore a tie and a suit. A salesman's suit. And underneath, in the wobbly, clumsy handwriting of a 9-year-old, the most devastating message of all, "Unless Ray says this is our secret. If I tell, Daddy will go to jail." The world ended in that moment. The word, "unless," with its childish misspelling, was the most damning piece of evidence of all. It was a small, innocent mistake in the face of a cosmic horror. It shattered the glass case of his life. It wasn't just a crime. It was a desecration. It wasn't just about what Ray had done. It was about the betrayal. The insidious, calculated abuse of trust. The violation of David's own blood. The man Ray was supposed to be, the brother he was supposed to protect, had been a parasite. He had used his position as a trusted uncle to poison David's own home, to violate the most sacred trust a man could have in his family. The grief was a physical blow, a white-hot pain that tore through his chest. The anger, however, was a wildfire. It was a blind, raging, consuming inferno that threatened to burn everything in its path. This was no longer the quiet craftsman. This was a primal force, a father facing the unthinkable. The calloused hands, the tools that built cradles, he imagined them wrapped around his brother's throat. The thought was as natural as breathing. It felt righteous. It felt necessary. The urge to go to Ray's apartment, to the sleek little place in the city, But he didn't. He didn't because he heard her voice. In the stillness of the night, in the silence of his own shock, he heard Chloe's whisper from the hallway, scared and fragile. "Daddy? Are you still awake?" The question, so innocent, so trusting, was a knife in his gut. He realized in a flash of clarity that his anger was a luxury he could not afford. It was a selfish act of self-destruction. He was no good to her in a prison cell. He was no good to her rotting in the ground. His rage, as justified as it was the very thing that Ray was counting on. He didn't confront him. He didn't march to his brother's house and scream. He didn't try to get a confession out of him with his own two hands. He did something far more difficult. He put his emotions in a box, bolted it shut, and buried it deep down. He channeled all of that raw, primal energy into a colder, more calculating purpose. He played the long game. He was now a hunter, and his brother was his prey, but he was a hunter who would use the weapon of justice, not the weapon of the mob. He called a lawyer. An excellent lawyer. A man who dealt in evidence, in facts, in the cold, hard truth of the law. He then went to a private security firm and had hidden cameras installed inside Chloe's room. The waiting was a form of hell. He went through the motions. He ate when Sarah put food in front of him. He smiled for Chloe. He hugged her and told her he loved her a dozen times a day. He watched her like a hawk, but he was a silent sentinel. The poison was still there, the secret of cancer eating away at her little soul, but now he was the one holding the scalpel, waiting for the right time to cut it out. 2 weeks later, the call came. Ray was coming to visit. The familiar, cheerful voice on the other end of the line, a voice that had sounded so normal just weeks ago. "Hey, big brother. I'm in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by and see my favorite niece. Does the little artist still have her paints out? I'm a big fan of her work." David's hand was ice cold. The rage flickered, but he held it down. "Sure, Ray," he said, his voice perfectly level. "She's in her room. Come on over." He placed the call and then went to his study. He sat there, staring at the feed from the security camera on a small, hidden monitor. He saw Chloe, her face pale, her hands trembling. He saw his brother walk in, wearing that familiar salesman smile. He saw Chloe's shoulders stiffen, saw the fear flash in her eyes. He saw the exchange. He saw the gifts Ray brought, the cheap baubles he used to bribe her silence. And then, he saw the moment the camera couldn't see. He couldn't watch anymore. He turned off the monitor, tears streaming down his face. He took the evidence, the digital recordings, and the painting he'd found, and he went to the police station. He walked in, handed over the truth, and walked out. He had delivered his judgment. Now, it was up to the system to carry it out. The fallout was a hurricane. The arrest was the eye of the storm, a moment of terrifying peace before the world. Woodworker's brother arrested for heinous crimes against child. It was splashed across the front page. The whispers started in the neighborhood. He lost a few clients who didn't want to be associated with the scandal. And the family. Oh, the family. His mother, a sweet, devout woman who had never had a bad word to say about anyone, was shattered. She couldn't understand it. "He's your brother, David. How could you do this to him? You're ruining his life." She begged him to drop the charges, to forgive him. "Families take care of their own," she'd cry. "We don't air our dirty laundry in front of the world." She pleaded with him to help Ray, to post bail. The money was there. The business was there. They had savings. But David refused. "No, mother," he said, his voice a hollow echo of the man he used to be. "I'm not bailing him out. I'm not turning this into a family squabble. The man who did this is not my brother. He is a monster in my brother's skin. I will not help him escape the consequences of his actions." It was the hardest thing he ever did. He looked into his mother's eyes, saw the disgust, the disappointment, and the utter devastation, and he held his ground. He had to protect his daughter, even if it meant losing the rest of the world. The trial was a public nightmare. They sat in the gallery, David and Sarah, holding hands, their faces pale and stoic. He watched as his daughter, his little Chloe, was led onto the stand. She looked so small, so fragile in that big, scary courtroom. She clutched a stuffed bunny, a tattered old toy she'd had since she was a baby. Her voice was a whisper as she testified, but it was a clear whisper. It was a voice of truth. She recounted the details, the secrets, the threats. Ray's lawyer tried to paint her as a liar, a confused child who had been manipulated by a paranoid father. David's lawyer, a bulldog of a man, presented the evidence, the camera footage, the painting, Chloe's clean, pristine testimony. The jury was out for only 3 hours. 15 years. The sentence felt like a lifetime, but it felt like a slap on the wrist for the crime committed. He saw his brother led away in chains. He saw the mask of the charming salesman fall away, replaced by a snarl of pure hatred. Ray looked back at him, his eyes promising vengeance. David just stared back, his own eyes empty. He had won. But the victory felt hollow. He walked out of that courthouse into the blinding sun, a free man, but he felt like he was dragging a chain of his own. The first night after the trial, the house was silent. A stark, quiet silence that was more deafening than any scream. Sarah was asleep, exhausted from the ordeal. But David couldn't sleep. He couldn't even close his eyes. He went to Chloe's room. She was sleeping, but it was a restless sleep, her little brow furrowed. He knelt beside her bed, the same place where he'd knelt on that terrible night in the closet. He looked at her, at the shadows under her eyes, at the tiny, fragile form that held so much pain. He leaned down and whispered to her. He didn't talk about Ray. He didn't talk about the trial. He didn't talk about justice, or revenge, or any of that. He only said, "My little lion. My strong, brave lion. You are so much braver than I ever was. You taught me what it means to be strong. You taught me what it means to be a father. You are my greatest masterpiece. You are the sunshine. You are the light. And tonight, and every night, I will be your shield. He sold the woodworking shop. It was a painful decision, a piece of his soul. He'd built his life there, but he had to rebuild a new life for Chloe. The money went to the best child therapist in the state. He took a job as a foreman at a construction site. It was humbling work, but it paid the bills. It was honest work. He started paying attention. He learned to read the silences. He learned to listen to the things that weren't being said. He stopped living in the fog of his own life and started living in the light of his daughters. The process of healing was slow, agonizing, and non-linear. Some days, Chloe would laugh, a bright, happy sound that lifted his spirits. Other days, she would retreat back into her shell, her eyes going distant and cold. He learned to just be there. He learned to not push. He'd sit with her in her room, not saying a word. He'd take her to the park and just push her on the swing, the rhythmic creak of the chains the only sound. He'd read to her at night, his deep voice a comforting presence. And then, one day, he came home and found her at her desk. The curtains were open. The sun was pouring in. She was painting, but she wasn't using a candle. She was using the light. The beautiful, brilliant, natural light of the day. She had painted a portrait. A simple portrait. It was a lion. A big, powerful, majestic male lion with a glorious golden mane. He was standing on a rock, his head held high, his eyes looking out over a vast, sun-drenched savanna. He wasn't a roaring lion. He was a silent guardian. He was a protector. And underneath it, in her now neat, careful handwriting, it said, "My daddy is a lion." David took that painting and he framed it in the finest, hand-carved mahogany frame he could make. He placed it in the living room, right above the fireplace. It wasn't a trophy of his victory over his brother. It was a trophy of his victory over himself. It was a symbol of the father he had become, the man who had faced the darkest parts of himself and had chosen to be the light. He never forgave Ray. He couldn't. Forgiveness, in the way he understood it, was a sacred thing, a gift you give to someone who has earned it, who has shown true remorse. Ray had shown none. But he had also learned something else. He had learned that the act of pursuing justice, of holding someone accountable, can be a form of poison if it is done with a heart full of hate. He had done it for Chloe. To protect her. To heal her. And in doing so, he had healed himself, piece by piece. He had learned to move forward. Every year, on the anniversary of the trial, he doesn't celebrate. He doesn't call the prosecutor. He doesn't send a letter to Ray. He does something private. He takes his daughter out for a simple ice cream. A single scoop of vanilla in a sugar cone. He sits with her in the park and watches the world go by. He doesn't talk about the past. He doesn't mention Ray. He talks about the future. About her dreams. About college. About the books she wants to write. He talks about the joys and the beauties of life. It is his small ritual. His way of reminding himself that his life, and his daughter's life, are not defined by the horror of the past, but by the promise of the present. That is Chloe now. She's a therapist, can you believe it? She helps other children. She uses her art. She uses her voice. She took the pain that was meant to destroy her and she turned it into a life's work of healing. She's my hero. She is the proof that the darkness doesn't have to win. It took a man's soul to the brink, but it didn't break him. He learned the most important lesson a man can ever learn. That the greatest revenge isn't destroying the person who hurt you. It's building a life so full of light, so full of purpose, that they can never touch you again. So, you see, this story was never really about the revenge. It was about the journey. It was about the painful, necessary act of confronting a truth so terrible it threatened to destroy you. It was about the courage to not let that truth poison your soul. Because in the end, we are not what happens to us. We are what we choose to become. The shadow is always there. It follows you, it whispers to you. But the light is always stronger. The light is always there, waiting for you to turn your face toward it. You just have to have the courage to step out of the closet. And that, my friends, is the truth.